Hello guys, so today I'm going to be talking to you about individual differences. Please do let me know if there's anything unclear in this video, and I'll be happy to answer them either by email if you want to send me an email, or if you want to get in touch and ask for a meeting in my office, that's also possible. So individual learner differences or individual differences is a concept that has been mentioned by Dornier in 2005, and when he mentioned it in his book, I believe, it was considered to be part of the non-language influences on second language acquisition. So I will have a small exercise here that I'd like you to try at home. The label or the title of this exercise is "I like you, you are different." Now, what is it exactly? It asks you to write 3 things that make you feel good and that make you different from other students or learners or teachers in this class. And if you do this exercise, in fact, some background about it, it was achieved or realized. Initially, it was coined by a lady called Moskovitz in 1999, and the initial aim behind this exercise was to enhance learners' self-esteem by developing closer and more satisfying relationships and also ensuring a positive outlook on life. She also saw this exercise as promoting harmony, closeness, and personal growth. So after doing this exercise, the result is just to have an idea about what are the preferences that learners have, what are the things they feel more comfortable sharing as far as their qualities, their attributes, their characteristics, which people can use later on to enhance learning situations. Another activity, which maybe if you have time, if you take a piece of paper and think about it for a few minutes, is to consider what are the good language learner qualities. What qualities distinguish a good language learner from an average or mediocre language learner? And questions such as what do you think distinguishes a good L2 learner are some of the things people consider when considering or maybe when eliciting some characteristics of good language learners. And we ask ourselves whether there are certain distinctive features, characteristics that these learners have that others don't have. Also, you can think about some anecdotes or experiences from your teaching about some learners who were different from the lot and who were actually more able to achieve better proficiency in second language learning than others. And why are they successful, or what made them more successful than others? So this is something that I will let you do at your own leisure and at your own time. Now, according to Lightbound and Spada, in 1993 they performed a study and they derived a few attributes or qualities of language learners. Remember now that Dornier says that these are different attributes which are not language specific per se. So according to Lightbound and Spada, if you can look at slide number 5, you will notice that the good language learner has the following characteristics, and you can see whether you agree or disagree with some of these characteristics, of course. I have bold printed some of the keywords in the slide. He or she is a willing and accurate guesser. He or she tries to get a message across even if specific language knowledge is lacking. Is willing to make mistakes, so more of a risk taker than others. Constantly looks for patterns in the language, regularities, trying to figure out the system of the language. Practices as often as possible. Analyzes his or her own speech and the speech of others, having an awareness. Remember Schmidt's noticing hypothesis, right? Attends to whether his or her performance meets the standards she or he has learned, enjoys grammar exercises, begins learning early in childhood. So here we have something related to age, which is not something they can control. Has an above average IQ, and we will come to the notion of intelligence later on, and IQ, and has good academic skills, and finally has a good self-image and lots of confidence. Now you notice among all of these different attributes and qualities, some of them are not really things that learners choose because they come equipped, so to speak, with it. with them. So it's not something they can choose. But others, on the other hand, may be said, or maybe we can actually argue that some of the other ones can probably become a habit or developed in learners. For example, if we talk about having a good self-image, there's something that comes with time and confidence, and it may be, although it may be intrinsic to learners, later on it is something that people can develop as well. In the next slide, meaning in slide 6, I have a series of questions that I'd like you to look at your own time and leisure, that in fact are questioning some of the characteristics of language learners, whether they are related to IQ, to gender, to the ability of learners to memorize. So you can look at these and maybe consider whether you think they are correct or not. So you can do this at your own leisure. Now let us go to slide 7 and think about one characteristic of learners which is not something that they control and that we haven't really talked about this year or this semester. That is gender. Is the variable of gender a variable that can be explored in terms of distinguishing between successful language learners, meaning males and females? Which one is who is the more successful as acquiring a second language? Now I'm appending 3 studies at the bottom of slide 7, and these studies have shown, starting with the first one by Kimura, that girls begin to talk sooner and more clearly than boys. So there is already statistical significance that show that girls talk sooner and more clearly than boys. And the same study also shows that the average 20-month-old girl has twice the vocabulary of the average 20-month-old boy. In addition, 2 studies, one by Howell et al. And one by Berninger et al., show that boys are much more likely to be diagnosed with stuttering and handwriting issues comparatively when compared with girls. And the study number 1 and study number 3 show that there are no gender differences in the areas of vocabulary knowledge, but that girls or females tend to have more advanced spelling and grammar skills. Now let us go to slide 8. We are going now to look at an area which is related to the analysis of neurology and fMRI, meaning functional magnetic resonance imaging. This is an area of neurolinguistics and second language acquisition. And an fMRI study shows that first, girls had a greater brain activity in 3 known language areas in comparison to boys when completing a reading comprehension or a word meaning task. So in the area of reading comprehension or word meaning, the activity was noted in 3 areas of the brain, and these areas are the following: the inferior frontal gyrus, which is an area involved in word meanings and other language functions; the superior temporal gyrus on both sides of the brain, this is involved in sounds of words; and the fusiform gyrus on the left side of the brain, which is an area involved in the spelling of words and their visual identification. We continue now with slide 9. Another fMRI study by Douglas et al. In 2008 shows that girls' language ability was dominated by auditory or listening areas of the brain for accessing and processing information related to spelling and rhyming. So the dominance of girls' processing skills are mostly around the auditory and listening dimensions of language, while boys' language ability was dominated by visual areas of the brain for accessing and processing information related to spelling and rhyming. So here, what this means is that for the same skill, i.e. the processing of spelling and rhyming, girls would do more auditory and listening skills, while boys would be more visual in their learning. Here, this shows differences. It doesn't show which one is better, but it shows differences in processing information. Now let us go to the next slide, and in this dimension or this part of the lecture, I would like to talk to you about personality. And of course, we have briefly spoken about this when we talked about this maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago, especially when we mentioned the lecture on aptitude, I believe. And personality is generally conceived of as composed of a series of traits. So we have, for example, the pair extrovert or extrovert. Both spellings are acceptable. Extroversion versus intra or introversion. Neuroticism or stability, and I have a link for you to look at. Neuroticism, it's a test. What is it to be neurotic? What does it mean? You can look at the definition in the dictionary. And tolerance of ambiguity, when you have a sentence which is ambiguous, how tolerant are you, how able are you to reconstruct it and to make sense of it despite or in spite of its ambiguity. And risk-taking. On the next slide, on a light note, you can check this short survey about introvert versus extrovert people. But an important point to keep in mind is that an extrovert personality is not necessarily better than an introvert one, and vice versa. But the distinction of the two orientations does exist. So both extrovert and introvert personalities can be analyzed on the degree of arousal or the arousal level. And this arousal level identifies the amount and speed of our brain's activity. So as far as introverts are concerned, those who are highly aroused take in much more information per second than the average person. So being highly aroused, introverts tend to overload more readily, especially in highly stimulating environments where there are noises, there's different colorful events, and as a matter of fact, they need to diminish or limit the volume of the stimulation around them. Extroverts or extroverts, on the other hand, are those who are only minimally aroused with a minimum amount of information, and they tend to not think clearly or may even fall asleep if they do not receive enough stimulation from their outside environment. As a consequence, they need to increase the volume of the stimulation around them. You can check these questions on slide 13 and think about them. Think about one or two extroverted or extroverted and introverted students in your class or among your friends. Do you think that you tend to treat them differently, and how differently? And the second question to think about or to consider is, do you think either type of student or friend tend to have disadvantages in learning languages or other subjects when compared to other students? And also think about why. Let's skip to slide 15. Now we go to the second dimension of learner differences, which is intelligence. And intelligence is a general sort of aptitude that is not limited to a specific performance area, but that is transferable to many sorts of performances. And generally speaking, children with high scores on tests of intelligence tend to learn more of what is taught in school than their lower scoring peers. When it comes to intelligence, there are three types of intelligences. Number one is analytical, number two is a creative, and number three is the practical. The analytical intelligence, as the name suggests, is analytical or academic problem solving. This is another term for it. And it's related to solving problems that require a single solution. Creative intelligence, on the other hand, involves reacting successfully to new situations, to novel situations, and being able to manage or handle new ideas. Practical intelligence involves being able to solve problems with respect to daily tasks, practical things which are more on a practical basis. So 2 questions related to intelligence are the following. First of all, which of the 3 types of intelligence do tests generally target? And secondly, in what aspect of language learning is each of these 3 types of intelligence beneficial? So I let you think about these. Working memory now, It refers to the mental functions responsible for storing and manipulating information temporarily. Working memory is viewed as an important component of language aptitude, and I think we have not mentioned that when we did the lecture on language aptitude. It consists of three different areas, what we call the sensory memory, the working memory, and the long-term memory. And I'm using an analogy here. If you look at slide 18, the analogy is between visually browsing websites, that is the short-term sensory memory. The working memory is when you are classifying files, folders, and trying to browse through the folders. And the long-term memory is when you store in your hard drive. So it is something which is probably just giving you a glimpse of the three labels. But if you want to look at the model, it's a model that was developed by Baddeley and Hedge in 1974. And other components of the working memory are in fact four subcomponents of it. We have the first, it's called the central executive, and this one controls attention. The second is the visuospatial sketchpad, and it stores and rehearses visual information. The third is the phonological loop. This one stores and rehearses oral information. And the fourth is the episodic buffer that combines information from different sources. Now, this model is explained and analyzed at the link that I'm providing on page 19, and you can explore it and check it further. Cognitive styles. Now we move to another dimension of learner differences. Cognitive styles, also thought of as thinking style. This is a term that is used in cognitive psychology to describe the way individuals think, perceive, and remember information. And I think we also talked about this briefly last time we talked about learner attributes. So we have, for example, the whole list, analytical, and the verbal imagery model, and also the field dependence versus independence model. For slides 21 to 24, these are just a few activities for you guys to look at, to peruse. They are on the lighter end. It's just for fun. And these are aimed to test for field independence and field dependence. So, as a summary, if you look at slide 25, field independent people can quickly spot the embedded figures because of the following characteristics. They have intrapersonal orientation, they have stronger cognitive analysis skills, and they also function more separately in ambiguous situations. Now, when it comes to field-dependent people, they have trouble with quickly spotting the figures. They tend to see the entire perceptual field, the whole image, rather than the accumulation or the sum of parts, and they cannot differentiate between the more complex pictures because of the following attributes that they have, or traits: interpersonal orientation, stronger social skills, and the use of information from others in ambiguous social situations. Now, in slide 26, there is a table that shows some of the characteristics of field-independent versus field-dependent learners, and it lists some of the good, positive aspects which could enhance language learning versus the bad ones or the less felicitous ones. So you can see there are a few characteristics which actually would help or facilitate language learning. Field-independent learners are more analytical, they are better at managing attention, and field-dependent people are more holistic in processing information, and processes, or they actually process material as a gestalt, meaning as an organized whole that is perceived as more than the sum of its parts. When it comes to the more negative or some of the shortcomings of each type of learner, field-independent people are considered to be more detached, overly independent, not so good at personal relations, whereas the field-dependent people are not good at analysis or at identifying components. So some questions to ask at the bottom of the table are assuming that the assessment is true, which type of students would do better in language learning in the classroom. There are other questions that you can explore as well, which I also will leave you to think about and consider. Going to slide 27, there is a question here that asks you, there are actually 3 questions that ask you to read the passage on page 28 and to react to it and see whether you agree or not. And the passage is taken from a publication by Dunn and Griggs. And basically the synthesis of this passage is that it is giving the qualities or the attributes of each type of learner, and it is crafting or organizing or maybe designing particular tasks which would fit each of these learners. And you are free to look at it and to maybe consider whether this is true or not, or whether this is achievable or not. Going now to slide 29, and very briefly, we have different learning styles, and they can be summarized in the following terms. Learning styles refer to the characteristic ways in which individuals orientate or situate themselves in relation to problem solving. And some types of learning styles that have been considered relevant to language learning are 3. We have sensory preferences, meaning involving the senses. We have what we call inductive versus deductive, and we have synthetic versus analytical or analytic. Now going to slide 30 with the distinction between visual, auditory, and kinesthetic. So visual means that this learning style involves the use of seen or observed things, including pictures, diagrams, demonstrations, etc. So it is highly emphasizing the role of the visual in communicating information for learners of languages and to tap on their preferences for visual learning. Auditory is a learning style which involves the transfer of information through listening to the spoken world of self or others, of sounds and noises. And finally, kinesthetic means it's related to physical experience, and it's related to touching, feeling, holding, doing practical hands-on experiences. Now on slide 31, you will see that there is a question that asks you to think about some English teaching activities. For example, grammar explanation, vocabulary mini test, etc. That can be suitable for each of the 3 types of students, so you can think about which type of activities can potentially use each type of learning style and stimulate the learners who have a preference for each learning style. More on individual differences, there are 2 researchers, Oxford and Anderson, that have in fact identified a number of 20 style dimensions, of which 8 seems to be particularly important for L2 learning, and they have put them in pairs. For example, you will see in this publication, which is from 1995, that there are sets of learning styles which are in fact probably pairs of opposites: global versus analytic, field independent versus field dependent, etc. So I invite you, if you are interested in learning styles, to explore this publication and to look at some of the referenced work, which could actually point you to other works as well. For next time, we are going to talk about motivation, and I invite you to read the suggested reading, meaning chapter 12, pages 426 to 438 by Gass and Selinger. Thank you for your attention. If there are any questions that you want to ask me, you please direct them to my email, and I can also maybe talk to you about the content of today's lecture more in details in class. Thank you very much.